All right, let's get started. Today we're going to talk about how to make sense of your financial metrics when it comes to running your independent med spa or aesthetic business. This is something that a lot of our practices have questions about, and it's one of those things where sort of like, regardless of how many times you sort of look at a spreadsheet, it's just not super intuitive. And so a lot of times our practice owners and practice operators just kind of need a little bit of help sort of bridging the gap between what they see when they look at reports and graphs and numbers with what are they actually experiencing in terms of their take-home profits and their income at the end of every month. At a high level, I thought it might just be useful to introduce myself. So I'm Rahul. I'm the COO and CFO at Portrait, and I've been at Portrait since 2021. As kind of implied by the title, I oversee Portrait's finance and operations teams, which is great because it means that I get to simultaneously be a part of the launch and creation and design and growth of all of the practices that are a part of Portrait. But it also means that I get to, get a really good bird's eye view and a detailed view in the actual operations and performance of each of these practices as well. And so, between practices that we've brought over, existing practices that we've brought over, as well as new practices that we've launched, I'd say I've probably had the opportunity to look at the financials of probably close to maybe 500 different independent med spas at a really detailed level. And then, personally, I've been able to kind of oversee and help manage about 50 med spas. And so between, the 50 that I've got sort of direct hands-on experience managing, as well as the, other, call it 450 that I've sort of looked at as potential acquisition targets or potential takeovers. I've gotten to get a really good feel for what are the cost drivers that sort of drive the performance of these med spas, and what are the ones that are making a lot of money look like, and what are the ones that are kind of having more challenges look like. And then I guess just for full context, prior to Portrait, I've spent over a decade working in the healthcare technology space, both as an investor, kind of working in businesses that buy companies like med spas, as well as an operator, kind of helping to lead marketing, operations, and finance teams. And I was drawn to Portrait just because I'm super passionate about holistic health, but honestly, this webinar is not really about Portrait. It's mostly just about, as an independent med spa owner, how do you sort of make your practice as successful as it can be? What we really wanted to start with is to give sort of a bird's eye view of what a premium independent med spa looks like with one injector. So we're going to do a lot of these sessions where we talk about the financial profile and the financial drivers of a med spa. But what we thought would make more sense, as opposed to doing just one mega session, which would really probably take, half a day or more to kind of capture all that, we'd break it into sort of smaller bite-sized chunks. And so today we're going to really focus on a specific profile of an independent med spa, so not a corporate chain or not a significant number of locations, and really with a pretty small footprint. So just a single injector. There's a lot of lessons that we'll talk about today, which can be extrapolated into different med spa models, but this kind of just provides a nice, simple example for us to look at that we can then use to kind of identify the key drivers of things in this simplified model. And then again, in subsequent sessions, we'll kind of jump into other types of models that we're familiar with as well. So, from our experience, it takes like between 6 and 12 months for a med spa that really gets off to a good fast start to really kind of build to a meaningful scale. With one injector, we do see practices that get a bit bigger than this, but really with one injector, what we're really shooting for when we're launching a med spa, at least, is to get to about 80,000 per month in injectable revenue from that one injector. And that corresponds to about $1 million a year of revenue. And once you kind of get to that level, you can definitely grow beyond it, and you'd need additional resources. But up to around 80K a month, of course, depending on, pricing and average ticket size and things like that. It could be different, but roughly when you get to that 80,000 a month of revenue, you can still keep it really lean. You don't need to have lots of extra staff. You don't need to have multiple treatment rooms. You don't need to have, a really, really, really luxurious build out necessarily. You don't need to have lots of devices and things like that. You can just kind of focus on, a very core set of sort of basic treatments and services. And then once you kind of get beyond that, you want to start building a multi-million-dollar location. It gets more complicated. But so we've decided to just for this webinar session, just kind of focus on that initial, 0 to 80K kind of journey. So this is what it kind of looks like in what I would describe as sort of like a high income demographic area. So the examples that I looked at when I pulled these numbers were New York City, San Diego, San Francisco, Miami, Newport Beach. And so we've got, practices in all of these areas. And this is kind of what they roughly look like when they position themselves as a premium location. So not all of the locations that we work with position themselves as premium. And so I'm going to talk about like what the impact is in terms of how you price. But, this is sort of like for a premium med spa. So premium med spa with 80,000 of revenue, we always kind of break it out into variable costs, fixed costs, payroll. And so let's just start with variable costs. So variable costs, for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, are basically costs that increase as your revenue go up. So every single time you see a client, you're going to have to pay for more product that you will then in turn use to treat the client. So the cost of that product is a variable cost. Similarly, if you pay a credit card fee every single time a person makes a purchase, that's a variable cost because as your revenue goes up, that cost goes up. By contrast, a lot of the costs associated with independent med spas are fixed costs. So these are costs where no matter what the revenue is, the cost remains the same. So if you did $1 million a month in revenue, your rent would be the same. If you did $0 a month in revenue, your rent would be the same. And the same is true of other types of factors like the software that you pay for, the service providers you leverage like accountants or social media managers. And so we really kind of break it up into variable costs, fixed costs, and then payroll as its own category. So on the variable costs, the first thing and really the most important thing, this is what drives the profitability level of the vast majority of independent med spas, is how much you spend on product. So in a premium location, again, in New York City, San Diego, San Francisco, Miami, Newport Beach, a place like that, if you are really not playing the discount game and you're really sort of positioning yourself as a premium med spa, then what we typically see is that you can get your product costs down to about 40% of revenue. So this 32,000, that's just 40% of 80,000. So for every $100 that comes in, $40 of that will just go back to your suppliers in terms of the product that you purchased. And then $60 will be kept by you in order to pay other bills and then hopefully generate some profits. The second thing, which a lot of our clients don't really spend a lot of time thinking about, is credit card fees. So credit card fees are quite significant. They're usually around 3%. If you've got chargebacks or things like that, which do happen periodically in any small business, it can be a bit more costly. And so on a base of around 80,000, you'll typically see somewhere in the like $2,500 range in terms of cost. And then finally, you've just got your other sort of medical supplies, syringes, gauze, things like that. And that's typically in the 1% range. And so all in all, when you look at your variable costs, you're looking at something in the $35,000 range if you were an $80,000 practice, again, with premium pricing. So as you can see, this is sort of like the bulk of your costs. Then you've kind of got your fixed costs. And for our practices and the practices that I mostly work with, they're not really a lot of fixed costs. This is kind of the beauty of the independent med spas. If you want, you can keep your rent low. You can keep it between $1,500 and $2,500 a month. You don't really have a lot of costs in terms of utilities or construction or maintenance. you don't have to have a lot of service providers who are, operating within the space. You don't have complex financials. So you don't really have a lot of fixed costs. It's not like running a warehouse or something where you've got tons of equipment and tons of other things that you have to manage. And so it's honestly one of the great things about operating independent med spas is you just have to get to a really relatively low amount of revenue to cover your fixed costs, and then you're making good money. So in our sort of hypothetical example here, rent we usually see for a single provider med spa in a premium market would typically be in the 2,500 range. If you were in a less premium market, if you were in sort of a smaller city in kind of a middle class environment, then you might expect to see more of like $1,000 a month kind of rent, $1,500 a month kind of rent, and that would be for probably one treatment room in a reception area. But let's just for this example, we just pulled 2,500. Utilities tend to be much more significant than you expect. You include water, electricity, internet, all that kind of stuff, and it does add up, and so you get to around $500 a month. And then in order to be at 80,000, you could do it with no marketing. It'll just go much more slowly most of the time, and so usually a practice at this scale will spend around $5,000 a month in advertising. And then there's just another $1,000 on sort of random things like your EHR software, your marketing software, any service providers you're leveraging, like an accountant or a tax advisor or a lawyer. And so on a monthly basis, we really see the fixed costs quite low, sort of in the like 7,500 to 10,000 range. And then not every practice at this scale will have additional staff on hand. But at 80,000, you're probably doing quite a few appointments, over 100 appointments a month. And so, oftentimes at that scale, you'll want to have some kind of support, at minimum, someone who can help answer the phones, or perhaps someone, who can help with, making sure the treatment rooms are changed over in between clients and getting people prepped and things like that. And so, when you take into account all the payroll taxes, any health benefits you want to offer, things like that, like we typically see that these types of staff members will kind of cost fully loaded around $6,000 per month. So pretty significant investment, but oftentimes that can really allow you to treat more clients and see a lot more growth. And then finally, just sort of a catch-all, there's just this sort of other cost bucket. There's always more costs than you expect. Maybe you get hit with a random bill from the city. Maybe you decide to do a training because you want to learn a new procedure. Whatever it is, like we typically see, 5,000 or more in certain cases of just sort of other costs. So again, just kind of zooming out, for a practice that's doing $80,000 a month, is a single provider practice, has really premium pricing. And again, I'll kind of show what that looks like in a moment. What we would typically see is that they're bringing in 80,000 a month of revenue. They're spending around 35,000 on variable costs. They're spending around 10,000 on fixed costs. They have one person who's helping them, who fully loaded, they're paying around 6,000 per month. And then, there's just sort of this catch-all bucket of around 5,000. And so if you were running this practice, which, this is a pretty good looking practice, you'd be making on a monthly basis around $25,000 per month of profit. And again, the way that we typically see these practices go is it usually takes around 6 to 9 months to get up to this level. You can get the revenue there quicker, but usually you got to spend a lot more on advertising and things like that if you want to grow really quickly. So, there's a couple of just sort of like things to call out just one last time before I start jumping into the details. So the first is, I would say these are good product cost ratios, not amazing. If you were truly the most premium of premium, if you were in New York City and you were treating, really VIP clientele, like the number might get down to, let's say 30%. So, it would be kind of in the, high 20s of thousands. But, at 40% of revenue, it's still definitely what we would consider premium pricing. As I mentioned, low fixed costs, around 4,000 per month in true fixed costs. You could just turn off the advertising whenever you want. And then low payroll costs, just one headcount. And so when we come across practices that are at this scale, one provider that are not making much money, it's almost always because of one of three things. Number one is they're pricing. They feel like they're in a competitive market and they have to price differently. And so their product costs go up a lot. Then number two is that they really have overspent, in my opinion, on the build out. So they've got a really luxurious, sort of like much larger footprint than necessary. And they've probably spent quite a bit on furniture and decor and build out and construction and things like that, which I haven't included here. And then finally, they probably have a lot of staff. They might have a receptionist, a medical assistant, a PCC, all of that just to support, one provider. And so when that happens, you most likely will have negative profits. And so, these are kind of the key call-outs. So today, for the purpose of this session, just because, I was asked to keep it to around half an hour of content, we're really going to focus on that main driver, the product cost. So, as you saw here, 40% is what we had sort of said would look like. And so, the practices that we work with at Portrait are all what you call sort of independent practices. We don't work with, any corporations that are in aesthetics. We don't work with any chains. We'll work with people who have up to a few locations. But really, once you're sort of in the 5 million plus kind of revenue range, it doesn't really make sense to work with Portrait at this stage. And so we're mostly working with practices that don't have scale when they start. And we'll talk about why that matters. So, we're not using any real prices here. These are all just numbers that I got on the internet, but as we all kind of know, these are pretty close to reality. So here's what we were just looking at. So at 40% product costs, the monthly profits are around 25K. We just established that on the previous slide. So let's just kind of look at what that means in terms of what you're actually offering. So, let's assume no waste. A lot of our practices do have a little bit of waste on neuromodulators, but let's just assume no waste to keep the math simple. And let's say you're buying Botox at $630 per unit. If you were, generating 40% product costs, that would mean that you'd have to be charging, including discounts, including everything, $1,575 a unit. So, in a market like New York City, or San Francisco or San Diego or Newport Beach or somewhere like that, you might be able to get $1,575 per unit. We do have practices that are able to be competitive with that kind of pricing, but I think we'd all agree this is a pretty high price, right? So even at this, pretty significant price for per unit cost of Botox, which is the majority of pretty much all of our practices, then you're going to see that 40%. So not amazing, but pretty good. You can get to that 25K profit on 80K. A similar, not the entirety of the revenue mix is in toxin. And so, similarly, if you looked at buying a syringe of Voluma, at $415, which just based on a quick Google search is like roughly the rack rate for an independent med spa. To get that 40%, you have to sell Voluma for over $1,000 per syringe, which again, we do occasionally see it, but it's on the high end. It would really be quote unquote premium. Now let's just kind of look at how this changes as your pricing changes. So let's say instead you wanted to be kind of more of a mid-price, let's call it like a Trader Joe's affordable luxury type of experience. Then in order to get to that 50% product cost, if you got to that 50% product cost, you have to give up around $8,000 of profit. So if you go from 40% to 50%, your monthly profits will really decrease, just using these toy numbers, from 25,000 to around 17,000. So it's a pretty meaningful hit to your overall profitability. And let's see what that looks like. So, again, assuming no waste, assuming you're buying Botox at what Google suggested was the rack rate, and 50%, that would mean that you'd have to be selling Botox at $1,260 per unit, which is actually not that low. There's plenty of people out there, especially physicians, offices, and places like that, which view it as just sort of a small add-on who are willing to sell it much cheaper than this, right? And so, at $1,260, you're already kind of in this mid-price category, and your profits are falling, rapidly at this point. For every 10%, you're going to lose about $80,000. And then similarly for Voluma, let's say you're buying at that $415 per syringe. At 50% product cost, you'd have to sell at $830 per syringe, right? It's just 415 times 2. And so, $830, that's also a pretty high price. It's definitely kind of in that high mid-price, low premium kind of category. And you know, this is what you sort of describe as sort of like an intermediate pricing practice. And then let's go a little bit further, and let's say you wanted to really be more of a price competitive practice. You know, you wanted to be able to do advertising and sort of like attract clients who are really interested in looking for deals. You were trying to, you know, compete in a really competitive market where a lot of people are offering these services. You're kind of dealing with a lot, you know, typically younger clientele who are not as experienced in aesthetics and who sort of view the products as commodities, which, you know, we all know they're not. And so let's say you wanted to kind of play that game, you know, you want to be a discount practice. Well, at 60% product cost, your profits would go from that 20,000, 24, sorry, it's a typo, 24,800, which is what we saw at that 40%, to 8,800. So now you're really starting to get down to the sort of minimum viable level to get to profit. And then let's just sort of look at what does that actually mean in terms of the price that you're able to offer clients. And so, you know, again, using that $6.30 at 60% product cost, you're selling for $10.50 per unit. And, you know, $10.50 per unit is not that low. Like if you were to look at a lot of markets, you could definitely find places that'll do an unlimited amount of toxin for you at $10 a unit. You know, and so even at this $10.50 per unit, you're starting to really get into the difficult part of the curve when it comes to making a lot of profits. And then, you know, Voluma, that actually would be a bit more doable, you know, at $4.15 per syringe. If you were shooting for that 60% product cost, then you could sell that for around $700 a syringe, which would be a totally acceptable price in pretty much any market. And so, you know, it's just kind of interesting to look at, right? If you kind of start at the beginning, hey, you've got $1 million a year practice, that's awesome. You know, it really takes quite a lot of work and talent to build that. And you can make great money. You know, you can make $25,000 a month, right? $300,000 per year. But it really all hinges, for the most part, on this product cost area, right? And if you can keep it at that premium pricing, you know, which may or may not be possible depending on, you know, the type of practice you're running and the amount of experience you have and, you know, the type of environment and region that you're in, you can make that great money. But then as you start to bring down your costs that you sell to your clients, you know, whether it's because you're trying to attract new people or because you feel like you're just forced to because there's, you know, other competitors down the street, those profits fall off dramatically, right? And so by the time you start playing, you know, $10 a unit Botox game, like you're making less than $10,000 a month on $1 million practice, right? And $1 million practice is a lot of work. That's a lot of work to do to make $9,000 per month. So you know, I just went into my local Groupon. You know, I'm based in the Bay Area, and I just typed in Botox, and these were, you know, the first 6 that popped up, right? And so you just kind of look at this, and it's $199 for 20 units, right? That's less than $10 a unit for Botox. This is $176 for 20 units, right? That's less than $9 a unit. And these ones I'm sure are similarly priced. I just couldn't see it because it's not in the title. So, you know, there are people out there who are playing this game. And, you know, I guess what I'd suggest is that's, you know, at best a short-term strategy. You know, unless you're willing to really play for extremely high volume, it's going to be very difficult to generate any meaningful profits if you're, you know, playing this sort of strategy for a long time. Now, one thing that I thought would be, you know, just interesting. First, let's just kind of summarize the lessons here. So, you know, you've got $80,000 per month practice, and, you know, that corresponds to about $1 million per year of revenue. You know, I think we'd all agree this is an incredibly successful single provider practice, really busy, you know, seeing a lot of clients, you know, obviously have a lot of really loyal clients because, you know, there's no way you'd be able to do 80,000 a month just with all new clients. And you know, the profits really kind of follow this curve, you know, from 24,000 to 17,000 to 9,000. It's all just kind of hinging on these product costs. And, you know, and so this model that we've been showing you, this is assuming a very simplified practice, right? Injectables only. There's no skincare products. There's no microneedling. There's no hair, there's no weight loss, none of the other types of procedures. But, what we do see is that for a typical independent med spa, neurotoxins and fillers are really sort of like the workhorse of the practice. And, I guess just as a final takeaway here, I just say that no matter how low you keep your fixed costs, it's great to be lean, as a practice from a financial standpoint. But no matter how low your fixed costs are, you can't outrun really sort of like discount pricing. Like you'll never be able to make significant money if you aren't able to control your prices. So let's kind of look at it from another angle. And I'll kind of wrap up here. There's another few slides, and then we'll jump into a few questions. But let's look at it from another angle. So let's say instead that you were a large format practice, okay? Let's say that you were one of the chains that we all know and compete with, which has, let's call it 50 locations, 100 locations, 500 locations. And let's say instead that you were paying $575 a unit, which again, just sort of a Google search. These aren't real numbers, but I'm pretty confident that there are people out there getting that for this or less. And you're paying $250 per syringe for Voluma. And imagine you were one of these large scale players, and you sort of had that kind of pricing, either as you were kind of rising up in the tiers with the suppliers, or you just had contract pricing because you were a really large player. So let's kind of revisit all of those examples. So let's say you wanted to be premium, quote unquote premium. We kind of saw that as an independent med spa, you needed to charge what? You needed to charge $15.75 per unit, just using the $630 per unit example. As a premium at a scale med spa with $575, you only need to charge $14.38 per unit. So this is kind of how the chains are really sort of unfairly, in my opinion, positioned to compete, right? They can sort of achieve that same kind of margin profile at a much lower price, right? And it's obvious when you think about it, hard because they're just paying less for the product, right? And so to get to that premium, they would only need to get $14.38 per unit out of their clients. And for Voluma on a $250 syringe, they only need to charge $625. I mean, $625 for a syringe of Voluma is really low, especially for a premium location. So they would almost certainly be charging quite a bit more than this, maybe 800, 900,000, and which would mean that their product cost would be even lower. It might be 20% on a syringe of Voluma. Similarly, let's say you want to be a mid-priced, at $575 a unit for Botox, you could do that for $1150. Or if you want to do it for Voluma, you could do it for $500 per syringe. And that's just to be mid-priced. We would kind of look at these and say, hey, this is starting to get into, discount, sort of like price competitive approach. And they're getting mid-price margins with that, right? And so it just kind of shows like for an independent med spa, you have to, kind of fight a little bit of an uphill battle here in order to compete, because for you're just going to make a little bit of margin on the same thing that a big player is going to make a lot more margin, right? And so you're kind of less resourced and less staffed, and then at the same time you've kind of got this structural pricing disadvantage. And it makes sense from the supplier standpoint. Like if they can sell more product, they're willing to do it cheaper. That's just kind of standard supply and demand economics. But we're the ones who are sort of like working with practices who are experiencing these realities on a day-to-day basis, right? And so, despite the fact that it makes sense, it is just a very difficult feature of the aesthetic markets. And then let's say you wanted to go discount. Well, if you were a really large purchaser, let's say you had 500 locations, you could generate that same 60% at $950. So now you can kind of understand why, if you look at sort of a really well-known franchise kind of thing, they can do these promotions that really would not make sense for one of our practices. They wouldn't make sense for an independent med spa. They would only make sense if you could get really low cost product, or you could get some other kind of product which you don't have to pay much for. And then the Voluma you could sell for nothing, right? You sell for $415, which would be a great, and that starts to lead to unfair kind of marketing circumstances, because those large format practices can then go and promote these low prices, and then all of a sudden clients that are a little bit more susceptible to bargains, they might be seduced and actually consider going and finding their practice. So, all to say that you got to make sure you're playing a winning hand. So this is a really simple sort of 2x3 matrix, which just shows sort of like how do we, when we look at practices, sort of perceive the health of the practice in terms of what type of practice is it and what type of pricing are they offering. So in that first column right here, you've got this low volume column. So, that's just, as an independent med spa, like you're going to be low volume. There's just no way around it. You're never going to be a top, 10 account for one of these major suppliers unless you have, 100 plus locations. And so, or maybe 50 plus locations. And so you're always going to kind of be in this low volume bucket, even at $1 million, per year of revenue. And then on the left side, there are these 3 rows: discount pricing, mid pricing, premium pricing. And as an independent, it's a pretty clear path, and, if you kind of are low volume and you're going discount, it's going to be really hard. You're going to have to get really, really, really big, and you're not going to make a lot of money for your time. And, for every hour that you and your provider or you, if you are or if the provider is the owner, are working, you're gonna really be sort of like scraping a little bit off the bottom of the barrel there. And it's tough, and it's just kind of, the challenge. And now that there's so many people pushing ads on Facebook and all these different places where all they're doing is pushing promos, like it can feel like almost a strategic reality that you have to play this game. And if you can convert them, those types of clients over time, which we do see some practices do sustainably, and we are going to have subsequent sessions on that, you can make it work. But if you stay in this bucket of low volume provider, which you would be as an independent med spa, and discount pricing, call it $10 a unit type Botox, or $500 a unit type Voluma, or the equivalent for any other product that you might offer across any supplier, it's going to be really hard. Even at $1 million a year of revenue, you're going to make like around $100K a year of profit. And it's hard to get to $1 million a year of revenue, especially when you're not making significant revenue per treatment. In mid-price, you can make pretty good money. If you can just stay, and you can just kind of stay in that happy middle, and just to kind of reemphasize what that is, if you can stay at $12.60 a unit, $8.30 a syringe, those are not low prices, they're not high prices, they're just kind of like solid prices. That's kind of what you'd say, and you really kind of make sure that clients understand that you're not just selling a commodity. Like you really need to think about who the provider is and what kind of experience you have, and the customer service really matters, and the type of sort of kind of follow-up and treatment planning and consultation, all that stuff. It's not just a product, it's really an experience, and it takes expertise and talent. And you can stay in that mid-price category, you can make great money. It's not gonna, you're not gonna be a millionaire, but you can make great money. You can definitely make, on $1 million practice, over $200,000 of profit per year. And then if you want to be in a really competitive market, or sorry, not a competitive market, but a high-priced market, call it a Bay Area, New York City, Miami, certain areas, places like that, Southern California, certain areas, even as an independent, you can go premium, right? And this is, this isn't something that you can just do. This is really market dependent. You're never going to be able to generate enough revenue and see enough clients and retain your clients if you're trying to charge $16 per unit in a smaller city, or in a in places like Texas or Atlanta, or places where it's just not that kind of market. Like you're just not you're just not selling to VIPs as much, right? And so here, like if you happen to be in one of these markets, even as an independent, you can definitely start to generate like really attractive margins, call it like 30% plus profit margins. but you have to stay incredibly disciplined. And then don't forget your fixed costs in those kinds of environments can be much higher. It's going to be very hard to keep your rent low if you're in, New York City, obviously, right? And so, you might make more money on the variable cost side of the equation, but you'll make less money on the fixed cost. But all things considered, you can definitely build a really high margin practice, even as an independent. And then, just again, to reinforce the point on sort of like, this is the game that we're playing, this is the playing field that we're on, independents versus these corporates, they really have, what I would describe as, unfair advantage, right? So even at that discount pricing, they can generate moderate, margins. They can generate moderate profits. What for us as independent practices would be really ugly, for them, they can actually make a real business off of that. And so that's hard, right? When you've got someone who's sort of thriving, doing the same strategy that for us is not resulting in us thriving, that creates like a very difficult competitive dynamic. And, at mid-price, they're making amazing money. They can make like, 25, +% profit margins, even without having to, really charge those super, premium kind of prices. And then, the high volume practices that also charge premium prices, they make, really, really, really significant money. And often, they're investing a lot more in fixed costs well beyond what any practices that we work with are doing. They're often doing like $1 million build outs, and they're trying to create sort of like a Four Seasons like brand. And they can do that because, they are able to get high volume product pricing. And at the same time, they're able to, charge really premium prices. And so for them, the spread is just huge. And so just to kind of, take it into a couple of bullets. So, the first is I would say that as, an independent med spa owner or potential owner, I'd say you have to align your marketing and your pricing strategy with your business reality. So, the case in point there is there's really not, unless you feel like you have absolutely no alternative and it's just a short-term thing, it doesn't really, in my experience, really make sense to be an independent med spa playing the discount game for a long-term strategy. If it's just a way to get some clients in the door and then you're going to, convert some percentage of them into memberships or something like that, that can make great sense. But to just do this over and over again, it's just going to be a very, very difficult, painful churn and burn kind of thing. And you're going to have to get to really high revenue just to make, what I would describe as like a single person sort of like, middle-class salary. Right. And so it's not a great strategy. And so you just make sure that whatever you're doing, taking into account the geography that you're in, the type of pricing you get, the resources that you have, just make sure you're in the right section. You want to be like at least yellow and ideally green, if possible. Number 3 is that if you have to stay independent, this is just saying the same thing, honestly, don't play the Groupon game. Not only can you not afford it, the clients won't stick. When people come in because they've found you on Groupon, it just means that they're a discount seeker by default. They're someone who's very susceptible. The only alternative is if you can get them into a membership, and we're going to have sessions on memberships and how to convert them and how to design them, and that can work, and that can kind of turn the odds a little bit in your favor. But if you're just a standard, practice with all the standard kind of characteristics, then do not, in my opinion, play the Groupon game. It's going to be very, very difficult to make it work. And then like focusing on that negative, but if you look, like 5 out of these 6 areas of this matrix are yellow or green, right? And so just because there's this one place to avoid, this danger zone, does not mean that you can't build something really significant. Like I've seen personally, just through practice that we manage, probably 50 or 60 practices that generate really significant profits per practice, or in terms of the practice that we look at when we think about potentially partnering with an independent practice or purchasing an independent practice. Like we see tons of practices that have done really great, and are able to make a lot of money. So it's not to say that you can't succeed, it's just to say that you have to make sure that your strategy aligns with your business reality. And if you can get that piece right, and you're a little bit patient, like you can definitely build something pretty meaningful. And here's the beauty of it, is that once you kind of get to a place where, almost regardless of what your pricing is, once you get to a place where your clients are mostly returning clients, it's not like you're just constantly trying to get new people in the door to keep your calendar full. Once you can get to a place where you've got a lot of repeat and returning clients, then you really can have a fantastic business which stands the test of time. Because the great news is that, assuming you've got, great talent, you're a great provider, and people are coming to you because they really, appreciate you and like you and they trust you. They're not gonna be on Groupon.com looking for, someone down the street who's willing to give them slightly cheaper Botox. They're going to be coming back to you, right? And so all of a sudden, it goes from this like very, very difficult kind of phase of, feet on the street, like, trying to hand out your business cards all day long, to, hey, now I've got like a great established clientele, and they just kind of keep coming back. So that's kind of a bit of what I thought I would share today. I guess the way that we're thinking about doing this is the first webinar session that we've done, but we're going to do lots, and we've got one scheduled every single week. And most of the time, we're going to try to bring in an external third party, like a consultant, someone from the industry, someone who operates a different practice. And the idea is that we sort of think that, it'll just bring a lot more breadth of perspectives to the conversation. And so for today, just because it was the first one, we used some of our internal data and information to get this from, and in subsequent ones, we'll go much deeper into these topics, related topics, and completely different topics. So I'm going to jump into Q&A, but I hope that was helpful. And we've recorded the session, and we're going to kind of edit it a little bit and clean it up, and kind of post it on a website. We're going to post all of our educational content, and any feedback or suggestions that you have for subsequent presentations, definitely let us know. You can just reply to that email where your registration occurred, and we'll be really eager to take that into account. So I'm going to jump into some questions here. So we got a couple of questions before, people who emailed them in. And then after, I got, there's one question I saw in the open Q&A, and so I'll reply to that as well. So, I think the first one that I saw is, what are early signs that I'm on the right track? Great question. I think the most important thing is that in the early days, you're not going to be able to see it in the numbers. The financials only start to really tell the true story once you're at some level of scale. And so the way that I would think about it is just look at your phone. If clients are reaching out to you, if people are booking a lot of appointments, if people are responding to you really positively, if people are referring, their friends and their family, if you're kind of getting that sort of organic feel for what I'm doing is really resonating with my clientele and my market, I think you're almost certainly on a path to success. And if you have that, again, we really see that it takes somewhere around 6 to 9 months for that to turn into, kind of like a established client base, which is in that, 60, 70, 80K plus per month kind of range. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say, is just kind of that feel, that qualitative assessment of, is there kind of that, that buzz generating? Is there that word of mouth that's starting to happen? Are people coming back? Are people, just doing what I kind of created as an incentive to get them in the door? Or are they, trying out lots of different things? The second thing I'd say is that, in today's market, where it is as competitive as it is, we strongly recommend that practices create membership programs. They just work really well. It's not a silver bullet. It's not gonna solve all of your problems overnight, but over time, it can make things incredibly smooth and predictable. And so just, what I would expect to see for sort of like a relatively new practice is that, let's say you've got $100 per month kind of beauty bank style membership where people are depositing funds. then typically I'd expect to see, somewhere in the range of 15 to 30 new members per month. So call it for every day that your practice is open, you're signing up 1 or 2 new members. It sounds like not a lot, right? It's like $1,500 of revenue if it's just 99 or 100 per month. But if you think about it, over time, those clients, they've already committed to sticking with you in the long run, which means that you can kind of really educate them, get them aligned around long-term treatment plans, all that sort of stuff. And then it just starts to add up. It just starts to stack up, right? And so you get 30 in the first one, you get 30 in the second month. By month 12, you got 360 members. And that is almost a completely full practice, right? And so it's sort of a longer term strategy, but it works great, and so that's kind of those are like the 2 things I would say is number 1, focus on the qualitative in the early days. And then number 2 is that if you are, using memberships, you can really get a little bit of an early signal on whether what you're working is resulting in sort of long-term positive sentiment from your client base. The second question, which we got ahead of time, was what is my target profit margin? So, even though a lot of this presentation was really focused on profit margin, I would actually say that there really is no target profit margin. It really just depends on what kind of strategy you're trying to deploy. If you were Ideal Image and you had hundreds and hundreds of locations, your profit margin by definition is going to be much lower than, by contrast, Skin Spirit, right? Which has much less locations, charges much higher prices, focuses on a different segment of the market. And so they've got very different profit margins, but Ideal Image has probably 10 times more locations than Skin Spirit does. And so even though they're making much less, I would assume, per location, overall, it may be a bigger business. I don't know. I haven't looked recently at the financials of either of those companies, but so I guess all to say, like, there really is no target profit margin. I think you just have to decide as a practice owner, what is the angle that you're looking for. So, if you're trying to, if you're someone who's working in the Midwest and you're a provider, and maybe you make $50 or $75 an hour after all things considered, and you're wanting to to kind of leave and get some financial independence, build your own practice. Well, you could do that by having a high price practice that doesn't have necessarily as many clients, but you're making a much larger percentage of that revenue. Or you could do it by having a high volume practice, and you're making less for each of those clients. You're more in that kind of mid-price category, the lower end of that mid-price category, and you could end up making the same amount of money, right? And so, again, it just kind of depends on making sure, like, whichever strategy you're in, just kind of commit to it. Don't try to do everything. Don't say, hey, I'm going to be a premium practice, but I'm going to run, Groupon promotions. Like, those 2 things are quite incompatible, right? And so you just kind of figure out which angle you want to get, and then, you can just kind of do the simple math, from that first page of the spreadsheet, and it'll like really clearly illuminate, how to do it. So that's the second question. And the last question, which is a really good question, it's a question that we get constantly, I would say, I personally get it constantly, is, how should I consider additional modalities when it comes to trying to create growth in my practice, right? And so, a lot of people are like, hey, look, if I can get an energy device, that's really going to open things up for my practice. Or if I, can start to offer weight loss products, like, that's going to really open things up for my practice and bring new clients in the door. And look, it's possible. It's definitely possible. We see a lot of practices that do bring on, new clients when they're able to like package new modalities into promotions and offers to get people in. But I would just be very cautious with that, because what I would say is, every successful practice that I've seen, I think probably without any exceptions, they've kind of got 1 or 2 things about their practice that they're really known for. So, in most cases, it's, full face correction, fillers, balancing, various kind of standard type practices. Occasionally, you'll have practices that really specialize in things like PDO threads, stuff like that. You can have entire clinics, obviously, that are focused on things like weight loss, but don't try to do it all. Just kind of pick what you feel like your practice is sort of, reputation is going to be built around, what your expertise is going to be built around, and think about that as the main way that you acquire clients. So just to kind of make it super concrete, if you're a practice that's really focused on, doing sort of like toxin and filler and more traditional type treatments, don't think, in my opinion, that offering weight loss is all of a sudden going to make you a huge practice, because it's not compatible with the type of practice that you're trying to create. You can definitely bring on other modalities, but I would think about them more as upsell opportunities, less as ways to kind of create new client acquisition, to get new client acquisition, right? And so, again, just to kind of summarize it, new modalities, great. If you've got an established client base, having full service makes a whole world of sense. But I wouldn't really overinvest or put all of my chips in expensive devices and things like that if you don't yet sort of have the kind of foundation of a really loyal clientele, which is what kind of all of these things are for. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into, I got 6 minutes left, so I think you can get through the remainder of the open questions. So first question's from Deborah, and she says that $5K a month for marketing. So that's what I had put as the placeholder in here. You can kind of see 5,000 on advertising. 5,000 sounds a lot for an independent small med spa. So that's totally fair question. That's a totally fair comment and point. And I guess I'll just kind of give a little bit of my perspective. So, at $80,000 a month, let's say that around half of your revenue is coming from new clients. So call it 40,000 from new clients. And let's say that your average ticket size is, $500. Okay, so that means that you need 80 new clients each month. And then let's say that of your 40 existing $1,000 of revenue from existing clients, maybe, one out of every few makes a referral. Well, I think what you'd probably see is that, out of the 80 new clients that you need, maybe you can get 20 or 30 from referrals, which means you got to get 50 additional new clients in the door in order to kind of make that math work. And so what we typically see is that fully loaded, to get a new client booked in the door, it costs about $100. And so that's kind of how that 50,000 number, I backed into it. But, we do have lots of practices and they all look very different. So, I've got practices that are doing, over 100,000 a month with just one provider, and they spend $0 on marketing and advertising. I've also got practices that are doing, $40,000 a month, and they're spending, $5,000-$10,000 per month on marketing. The one thing which sort of sneaks up on practice owners, I've seen at least, is that the marketing costs are not just the advertising. So let's say you're working with an ad agency. There's going to be all sorts of fees that are layered on. So let's say you're spending, $2,500 on ads. Most likely you're also paying that ad agency another $1,000 or $2,000 to manage those ads. You're perhaps also paying a social media manager another $500 a month to manage social media. You're maybe also paying someone else to manage your website. And so even though the advertising cost itself might not be $5,000, I often see that even when you're just spending a couple $1,000 a month on ads, when you kind of add it all together and you take into account all those soft costs, which I would consider money is money, it can get into that 5,000. But again, every practice is different. If you've got a really established clientele, you won't spend anything on marketing. If you've got no clients trying to get off the ground, and you've got a lot of access to capital and you want to grow quickly, and you've got investors, you might spend much more than this. And so there's just kind of a placeholder of what I've seen. And then Bruce asked, as far as memberships, would you think this would be a good step forward to converting my discounted med spa into a premium med spa? So absolutely. The great thing about memberships is that they essentially allow you to offer two different kinds of prices, right? So you can have your a la carte prices and you can have your member prices. And, when people think about what type of practice are you, if you have a la carte prices, which are sort of in the middle of the range or maybe even on the higher end of the spectrum, you can really position yourself as, hey, we charge $15 a unit for toxin, or we charge, $900 a unit, $900 per syringe for these types of fillers. And that would kind of be your a la carte pricing. But then you can also have member pricing, right? And that member pricing can be lower than that a la carte pricing. And, as long as it's not crazy, you can still kind of sort of like use that a la carte pricing to anchor your brand, but then also have that membership pricing as a way to, have more options for the people who are willing to kind of make a longer term commitment, but who are looking for more of a deal. And, the deal seekers, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I personally am a deal seeker in my personal life, but where it starts to get ugly is when somebody comes in, they just, do the bare minimum for the promo, and then you never see them again. They don't respond to your message, and maybe they even like put a negative review on your Yelp, and you're like, oh, that was terrible. Like, it was just a terrible experience for everyone. And so, the way I think about it is, if you can get someone who is value oriented and they're willing to become a member, well, then that's actually like, not really a problem. That yellow or that red in this bottom left quadrant, that starts to look more like a yellow, because, hey, they're going to come back for a year. I don't need to spend as much money on marketing because I've already got an established client base. And so everything kind of works a bit better. So I wouldn't say you could kind of jump from discount to premium. Like, that's going to be a really tough hill. But to go from discount to mid-price, that, we see that all the time, and that happens, quite quickly. You can do that in a few months, to be honest with you. Not always, but if it happens, if it's kind of executed well, you can totally do that. Okay, and then Daniela asks, what is the average cost of insurance for the scope of practice? So, of course, it depends on what kind of coverage you want to look at. So, most of the practices that we're looking at kind of have a standard kind of med mal plus commercial liability insurance. And, for the coverage levels that we typically look at, it's usually just kind of in the 100 to 200, maybe 150 to 200 per month kind of range. And so, it's not too bad. It's not going to be a significant percentage of the overall fixed cost base that you have. So that's kind of what we typically see. But, it really varies. Just make sure you're shopping around when you get insurance, or you're working with someone who you already have a pre-negotiated rate with.